It was one of the most controversial journeys in the history of late-night television. George Carlin did not walk onto Carson's stage as the rebel comic the world remembers. He began quietly, writing material, playing it safe, and delivering clean-cut routines for polite applause. For millions watching in the 1960s, he was just another young comic in a suit, blending into the golden age of television. But behind the smile, something was shifting. America itself was changing. Vietnam, civil rights, counterculture, and Carlin's voice soon followed. By the early 1970s, he wasn't safe anymore. His beard grew, his hair grew, and so did the edge in his words. Suddenly, this once clean comic was pushing NBC to its breaking point, dropping routines that shocked executives while leaving Carson and the studio audience in tears of laughter. On The Tonight Show, Carlin's transformation unfolded in real time. Some nights, he was nearly banned. Other nights, he made history. Carson could have played it safe, but instead, he kept inviting him back. Tonight, we count down 6 unforgettable George Carlin moments on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. And trust me, one shocked NBC and turned Carlin into a legend. To understand George Carlin on Carson's stage, you have to step back into the golden age of television. It was the late 1960s. America gathered in living rooms, turning the dial to NBC every night. The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, wasn't just entertainment. It was the national campfire. If you made it onto that stage, you weren't just a comedian. You were part of American culture. Carlin's early appearances showed a slim young man in a suit, his hair neatly trimmed, cracking safe jokes that fit perfectly into Carson's polished world. But what made him different was timing. Carlin arrived just as the old world was colliding with the new, when clean television comedy was giving way to a raw, rebellious energy that reflected the streets outside. And Carson saw something, while other networks hesitated. Carson gave Carlin the microphone again and again, sensing that this young comic carried the restless spirit of a generation. For audiences watching at home, it felt like a mirror of their own changing lives. The struggle between tradition and rebellion, between what was allowed and what was waiting to be said. That tension made Carlin unforgettable. At moment 6, we go back to a George Carlin many viewers barely recognize today. Long before the beard, the ponytail, and the sharp-edged satire, Carlin was the definition of a clean comic. When he first appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1960s, he wore crisp suits, slicked-back hair, and delivered quick, harmless one-liners that wouldn't offend a single soul in Middle America. The jokes were about airline announcements, everyday quirks, and the kind of light-hearted material that made audiences smile politely. Carson introduced him with the same warmth he reserved for rising talents, and Carlin played the role perfectly, sharp timing, a grin that hinted at mischief, but never crossing the line. For NBC, he was the ideal guest, safe, predictable, and easy to broadcast nationwide. Yet even in those early routines, you can see flashes of what was coming. Between the polite punchlines, there was a glimmer of rebellion in his delivery, a sense that he was biting his tongue. He had the rhythm of a stand-up comic, but also the eye of a writer who noticed hypocrisies others ignored. Audiences laughed, but Carlin was already restless. Carson, sitting just off to the side, smiled knowingly. He had a way of spotting talent before anyone else, and in Carlin, he saw a comic who could one day move beyond the safe walls of late-night television. For viewers at home, It was just another fun routine in the golden age. But for Carlin, it was the start of a journey. From clean-cut entertainer to counterculture icon. Nobody watching that night could have imagined that this polite young man in a suit would soon become one of the most controversial voices in American comedy. At moment 5, the mask began to slip. By the late 1960s, George Carlin no longer looked like the clean-cut comic that NBC executives had once praised. His hair was a little longer, his routines a little sharper, and his jokes carried a bite that television audiences weren't used to hearing. One night on Carson's stage, Carlin slipped in material that hinted at the shifting culture outside the studio. Instead of harmless airline routines, he poked fun at authority, at language, even at the politics that were dividing America. It wasn't yet the full counterculture Carlin, but it was the first taste of the rebel he was becoming. The audience responded instantly. Some laughed harder than before, relieved to hear comedy that felt honest and modern. Others gasped, nervous at the idea of a comedian daring to question things on live television. And there, sitting at his desk, Carson smiled. He knew the danger. NBC didn't like comedians who pushed the envelope, but he also knew it made for great television. Backstage, executives whispered about whether Carlin had gone too far. On paper, his jokes were still safe enough, but his delivery had changed. He leaned into the mic, letting silence hang, daring the crowd to follow him down darker, more provocative roads. For Carlin, this was the turning point. He no longer wanted to be just another comedian in a suit. He wanted to reflect the chaos of the world outside, the protests, the generational clashes, the shifting culture of the late 60s. And Carson, perhaps sensing history in the making, gave him the room to experiment. It was in these moments, half safe and half dangerous, that George Carlin stopped being a background comic and started becoming a voice of rebellion. Audiences didn't know it yet, but the Carlin they thought they knew was already gone. At moment 4, George Carlin had gone from safe to risky, and NBC was not happy about it. By the early 1970s, Carlin's comedy had sharpened into something uncomfortably real for television executives. His routines about language, politics, and hypocrisy in American life made the censors sweat. To them, he was becoming a liability. But Johnny Carson saw something different. Carson valued authenticity and instinctively understood what made audiences lean forward in their seats. He knew Carlin's edge wasn't a flaw, it was his power. So even when NBC suggested quietly moving on from Carlin, Carson kept sending him invitations. One appearance in particular showed the divide. Carlin launched into a bit that danced dangerously close to taboo. You could almost feel NBC executives tensing in their control room. Yet Carson didn't flinch. He laughed, leaned back in his chair, and gave Carlin space to breathe. The studio audience roared, their reaction proving Carson right. This was the kind of energy late night needed. For Carlin, Carson's loyalty was everything. Without Carson, NBC might have pushed him aside, labeling him too controversial for mainstream TV. But with Carson's stamp of approval, he kept a national platform. It wasn't just about laughs anymore. It was about legitimacy. Carson had the power to decide who America listened to, and by choosing Carlin, he kept the door open for a new kind of comedy. In hindsight, these moments feel pivotal. The network wanted safety, but Carson wanted truth. By defying the censors and embracing Carlin, Carson proved that late-night television could evolve alongside the country itself. And for audiences at home, The message was clear. The times were changing, and Carlin was the one saying it out loud. At moment 3, George Carlin delivered the kind of routine that television simply wasn't ready for, and Johnny Carson couldn't stop laughing. By now, Carlin had shed the last traces of his clean-cut image. His hair was long, his presence unpolished, and his material aimed directly at the absurdities of American life. That night, he launched into a bit that tore apart the everyday hypocrisies of language. Those strange contradictions everyone recognized, but nobody dared to say out loud on network TV. The studio audience erupted almost immediately. Laughter rolled across the room, louder and wilder with each punchline. But the person laughing hardest was Carson himself. Carson tried to hold his composure at the desk, but midway through the routine, he lost it, covering his face, slapping the desk, and doubling over in laughter. For a moment, the king of late night wasn't the controlled host. He was just another fan in awe of what Carlin was doing. And that reaction made the audience explode even more. Backstage, NBC executives weren't nearly as amused. To them, Carlin was walking the edge of what could be aired. But to Carson, this was exactly what late-night television needed. Unfiltered honesty delivered with razor-sharp wit. He knew television history was being made in front of him. For viewers at home, the moment was unforgettable. Seeing Carson break down, unable to control his laughter, gave Carlin's words an extra weight. If the host himself couldn't resist, how could anyone? It was raw, it was unscripted, and it was the kind of lightning in a bottle that defined The Tonight Show. This was no longer a young comic trying to fit in. This was George Carlin commanding the stage, and for the first time, Carson himself became part of the punchline. At moment 2, George Carlin pushed network television to the edge and left NBC executives horrified. It was one of those routines where every line seemed to test the boundaries of what could be said on live TV. Carlin had already become a lightning rod for controversy outside the studio. But bringing that energy directly onto The Tonight Show was something new. That night, Carlin launched into a routine that hinted at the very themes he would later become infamous for: words, taboos, and the absurd rules society pretends to follow. The audience gasped at first, unsure if they should laugh. Then, as the rhythm built, the laughter came in waves, rolling through the studio until people were doubled over. But the most important laugh came from behind the desk. Johnny Carson, known for his cool, unshakable presence, couldn't help himself. He leaned back in his chair, slapped the desk, and let out the kind of genuine, uncontrollable laugh that told viewers this was more than just comedy. It was cultural rebellion happening in real time. NBC executives, watching from the control room, weren't smiling. Some reportedly wanted the segment cut from future reruns, fearing it crossed an invisible line. Yet Carson's laughter gave the bit legitimacy. If the king of late night was on board, audiences felt safe to enjoy it too. For Carlin, it was vindication. He had proven he could challenge authority, shock the network, and still win over America with Carson by his side. In the tug-of-war between censorship and comedy, this moment showed exactly where the audience and Carson himself stood. It was risky, it was controversial, and for Carlin, it was another step toward becoming the voice of a restless generation. At moment 1, we reached the moment that felt less like comedy and more like history. George Carlin looking back on his career, right there on Johnny Carson's stage. By this time, Carlin was no longer just the rebellious comic who had shocked NBC. He was a cultural figure, a man who had shaped the very definition of stand-up in America. And Carson, always the steady host, gave him the space to reflect, instead of explosive punchlines. Carlin spoke with a surprising softness. He talked about his beginnings, how he once wore a suit and told clean jokes just to survive. Then he admitted that Carson had been one of the first to let him stretch, to take risks, to bring the counterculture voice onto mainstream television. The audience listened in silence, broken only by bursts of applause. They weren't just watching a comedian anymore. They were watching a man thank the very platform that had allowed him to become who he was. Carson leaned in, smiling gently, knowing that this was one of those rare Tonight Show moments where entertainment gave way to legacy. For NBC, it was ironic. Years earlier, executives had wanted him off the air. Now, the same network was broadcasting his gratitude to millions of homes. The closing laugh came quietly, almost humbly, as Carlin reminded everyone that it was Carson's stage that gave him the confidence to become himself. For fans, it was proof that even rebels need a door to walk through. And in that moment, the king of late night and the voice of America's rebellion stood side by side, cementing a friendship, a history, and a legacy that television would never forget. In the end, George Carlin's journey on The Tonight Show was more than a string of late-night appearances. It was a mirror of America itself. From the safe, buttoned-up comic of the early 60s to the rebellious truth-teller of the 70s, his evolution captured the shift of an entire generation. Carson, always the quiet gatekeeper, gave him that stage. He let Carlin be clean when America wanted comfort, and he let him be dangerous when the culture demanded honesty. That trust between host and comic turned television into something more than entertainment. It turned it into a chronicle of change. For audiences who watched in real time, those moments felt electric. They weren't just laughing at jokes. They were watching boundaries fall, one punchline at a time. And for Carlin, that desk across from Johnny was proof that even rebels could find a home in the mainstream, if only for a few minutes each night. These moments remind us why Johnny Carson remains the king of late night, and why George Carlin stands as the rebel voice who refused to stay silent. Together, they wrote a chapter of television history that still echoes today, long after the lights of Studio 6B have faded. As the credits of this journey roll in our minds, one truth becomes clear. George Carlin's story on The Tonight Show wasn't just about comedy, it was about transformation. From the clean-cut young man in a suit to the long-haired rebel who tested every boundary, his appearances charted the arc of a generation searching for its voice. And standing beside him through it all was Johnny Carson. Carson didn't just host Carlin. He protected him, encouraged him, and gave him a national stage when others wanted to shut the door. That quiet partnership between host and guest created moments that weren't simply funny, but historic. They revealed the power of television to reflect not just jokes, but the soul of a restless nation. For audiences, those nights were unforgettable. They saw the king of late night bend with laughter, and the rebel comic cement his place as a cultural icon. For Carlin, Carson wasn't just a host. He was the bridge from mainstream acceptance to lasting legacy. And for us today, revisiting these moments is more than nostalgia. It's a reminder that truth-telling, no matter how uncomfortable, can still find its way to the spotlight. If someone dares to hand over the microphone,